Behavioural economics on a post-it number 27, I believe, is it? Yeah, 27. In this short video, I'm going to talk about the requirements, or the original requirements, for a policy intervention to be defined as a nudge intervention. The nudge behavioural public policy framework was proposed by Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein in, I think originally in an article in 2003, under their framework of libertarian paternalism. So nudges are really applications of libertarian paternalism. And then famously in their very popular book, Nudge, the one with the big elephant, the mother elephant, I think nudging the younger elephant on the cover of the book, that they published in 2008 and that they've recently updated. Now, you know, Thaler and Sunstein's work was probably the major catalyst for the explosion in interest in applying behavioural science and behavioural economics to public policy design and public policy interventions over the last 12 or 13 years now. I think it's been an unfortunate occurrence over that time period is that people define many behavioural public policy interventions, and even public policy interventions that have no behavioural economic content whatsoever or behavioural science content whatsoever. People sometimes define those as nudges these days. So the categorization of what it means to be a nudge is widened far beyond, I think, what the original requirements specified. And I think that's unfortunate because it's bred a lot of intellectual confusion in the whole area. I prefer to keep the frameworks very separately defined from each other so that we know what we're talking about, and so that if we're proposing a particular thing, we know exactly what that thing what the implications of that particular intervention are. As a related point, you know, a lot of people think that the whole of behavioural public policy is nudging, and it's certainly not. You know, it's there's many other frameworks within public policy frameworks within the behavioural public policy canon that far extend beyond at least beyond the original requirements of what it means to be a nudge intervention. So in some of those frameworks, I would argue personally, are in many instances more profound really in terms of the implications that they can have than nudge interventions. Okay, so putting that preamble to one side, I'm just going to run through what the original requirements for a nudge intervention, for an intervention to be defined as a nudge were. And there are a few of these laid out by Thaler and Sunstein early on in their work. So the essence of nudging really is that, and the essence of the libertarian paternalistic framework is that people make lots of decisions during the course of their day, and most of those decisions are sort of automatic really. We don't really think about them too much. And you know, the heuristics and the rules of thumb that we've talked about in previous videos develop to help us to get through the day without having to think too much, and yet make choices that are generally, you know, good for us really, or, you know, allow us to lead our lives in a sort of functional kind of way. But because of, according to, you know, the libertarian paternalistic framework, because of the various heuristics and the rules of thumb and the behavioural economic phenomena, occasionally we make automatic choices that can conflict with deliberatively what we would really like to do. If we really thought about it, we'd probably want to do something else instead. So for example, you know, because of present bias, perhaps, maybe going back to the previous video that I presented, maybe some of us automatically choose to eat too much cheesecake during our desserts than apples or other healthier options. Because of that, you know, the emphasis upon the immediate pleasures from eating cheesecake. We don't think about it too much, but if we did think about it, perhaps we would want to choose the healthier option more often. So what libertarian paternalism is suggesting is that we change people's environments, or what Thaler and Sunstein call their choice architecture, such that people are more likely to make automatic choices more often than they currently do, that align with deliberatively what they really want to do, right? So we're not trying to persuade people to change their minds or to sort of explicitly alter behaviours in those sorts of ways. We're trying to go with the grain of what people do automatically, and hopefully by changing their environments or their choice architecture, hopefully for people that advocate nudge interventions, people will alter their decision-making behaviours in some instances. Now, a nudge has to be liberty-preserving. This is the libertarian aspect of libertarian paternalism. So you're not trying to coerce people or force people to change their behaviours. If people want to continue with their pre-existing behaviours, then they ought to be allowed to do so with a nudge intervention. So again, if we think about cheesecake and apples, there should be nothing in the nudge intervention that prevents people from choosing cheesecake if they so wish, if they want to continue eating that relatively less healthy option. Right? So we're not trying to coerce people. It's liberty preserving. It shouldn't involve large financial incentives, I suppose, for a couple of reasons. In some instances, significant financial incentives can be potentially a little coercive, I guess. Maybe people would be persuaded to do things that they don't really want to do, but they don't, the financial inducement just pushes them towards doing that new thing. So maybe, arguably, a financial incentive in some instances might be a little coercive, but perhaps more importantly, if it does involve a large financial incentive, it's a tool of standard economic theory, what's called the relative price mechanism. You pay people to do something and they're more likely to do it. Simple as that. That's a simple rule, simple but very important rule within the field of economics. So you would be extending beyond what the requirements of nudge interventions are if you offer large financial incentives. And of course, the intervention should be, if it's the nudge intervention, it should be informed by behavioural economics or behavioural science in some way. I've heard people argue that income tax is a form of nudging when I can't. A basic, straightforward income tax has nothing to do, I don't think, with behavioural economics or behavioural science. It's just standard economic theory. And then finally, it should target internalities. This is the paternalistic aspect of it, libertarian paternalism. So with the original nudge requirements, that the intervention should be trying to change behaviours for the good of those specifically targeted for behaviour change. So a nudge isn't one where you're changing behaviours because people are harming other people other than themselves, and therefore you want to change their behaviours to reduce those harms to other people. A nudge is an intervention that's specifically designed to reduce harms to those people targeted themselves, right? Internalities rather than externalities. And this is where a lot of the confusion with the nudging has been brought into the discipline, really, because people usually, I think it's more often the case that interventions that are essentially targeting externalities are now being defined as nudges. Sometimes it's called social nudges, but nonetheless there are targeting externalities. And I think personally that's been a very unfortunate development in the discipline, because it's associated nudges with implications that lie far beyond the original nudge requirements. So I think we ought to bring back some intellectual clarity. Now, if you look at these various requirements, I've outlined a capital letter in various places. Automatic liberty-preserving incentives or avoid large financial incentives. Behavioural economics and target internalities. And if you put them together, you get the mnemonic alibi. I'm not a big fan of mnemonics usually, partly because I find it difficult to say the word, but also because I think they're highly contrived. But in this case, often highly contrived, but in this case, alibi might just help you remember, jog your memory on what the 5, if you like, original requirements of a nudge intervention are. Okay, so I'm going to finish on that point. In the next post-it, I'll sort of highlight what I think is a classic nudge intervention, just to give you an application of this framework.